I think another way to understand the American Constitution is to contrast it with the other major form of democracy, which is the parliamentary system. Now, a lot of different countries have a parliamentary system, and you can even see countries that are hybrids between our type of system and the parliamentary system. I'm going to refer to the British system because it's the most directly parliamentary system, but realize that parliamentary systems exist in almost all Western European countries to some degree, Israel, just a number of different countries. Whenever you hear a country with a prime minister, that's going to have a parliamentary system. So what are the differences between these two systems, and what are the consequences for each different type? Let's take a look at that. So in the United States, we have a bicameral legislature. That means two houses, bicameral, two houses, and we call our legislature Congress. Now, the two houses of Congress are the Senate, which is called the upper house, and each state elects two senators. The lower house is the House of Representatives, and the districts in the House have equal population. So whereas each state has the same amount of senators, different states have different amounts of representatives depending on the population. All right. Now, in order for legislation to get through Congress, it has to pass both houses. Now, let's look at Great Britain. The British legislature is called Parliament. And Parliament also is bicameral. It has two houses. The upper house is called the House of Lords. And this is kind of a quaint British thing. The Lords are hereditary. That is, they pass their seats down generation to generation within the same family, or they're appointed. The Queen can appoint people to the House of Lords, and functionally the Prime Minister will be the one that essentially is the vehicle through which the Queen appoints the House of Lords. The House of Commons is much like our House of Representatives. It's the lower house, and it's based on districts with equal population. But here's the difference. For the most part, the House of Lords is ceremonial. It doesn't have a lot of power. It has a little bit of power. And there are law lords, which basically function like our Supreme Court. But for the most part, the House of Lords is not involved heavily in the legislative process. Instead, legislation just has to be passed by Commons. And once it's passed by Commons, it becomes law. So functionally, when we talk about Parliament in Britain, when we say Parliament passed a law, we're really looking at this. So even though the British legislature is technically bicameral, it's functionally unicameral. It really has one house that passes laws, and the House of Commons is that house. Okay, so for legislation to get passed in a parliamentary system, it usually has to go through one house, although again, in different systems, the upper house may have some controls, and may have the ability to veto legislation with a majority or something like that. Now, when we look at the executives, the British executive is the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is elected by the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister is also a member of the House of Commons. And so, in many ways, the Prime Minister is similar to the Speaker of the House in our House of Representatives. However, the Prime Minister is the executive. The Prime Minister generally appoints the cabinet, and the cabinet is what runs the government, just as in the United States. However, the American cabinet is appointed by the president, and the president is elected indirectly through popular vote. So we don't have direct elections for the president, but instead we go and we vote for electors, and essentially each state has a number of electoral votes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. And whoever wins the state wins that state's electoral votes, with a couple of exceptions. So basically, every 4 years we elect the president, and that's how our votes get translated into electoral votes, which is what elected the president. The other point to remember is that unlike parliamentary systems, the executive is not a member of the legislative body. We have separation of powers. Parliamentary systems have basically fusion of powers. So the president is not a member of Congress. Now, the vice president sits as the president of the Senate, but he, or probably someday she, doesn't really have much of a role unless there's a tie in the Senate, in which case the vice president can break the tie. So unlike the parliamentary system, the American president is not part of Congress. Now, if we look at how the legislatures are elected, this is kind of interesting. In a parliamentary system, generally the prime minister calls for an election. And that has to happen within 5 years. So the prime minister can't simply be elected and say, well, I'm not going to have any more elections. But the prime minister does have the ability to determine when elections occur. Now, of course, this is an advantage because they can wait until their party is really popular to call an election. But the other thing that's interesting is elections occur within a fixed amount of time. I want to say 6 weeks. And so there's not the huge long campaign time that we see in the United States. Instead, it's relatively short. And as you can see, it's probably more party-based than individually based. Another way that the parliamentary elections can be called is through a vote of no confidence. It doesn't happen very often, but if there's a division within the party that controls Parliament, they might, if they vote against a significant bill, that's called a vote of no confidence. I'll talk in a minute about coalition governments, and when coalition governments break apart, there's usually a vote of no confidence, in which case Parliament is dissolved and you have elections. With Congress, everything is done according to a constitutional framework based on time. So the Senate every 6 years, but it's staggered. So about a third of the Senate gets elected every 2 years, essentially, and they serve 6-year terms. In the House, every member of the House is up every 2 years. All right. So again, the electoral system is not based on any kind of calling of elections. It's based on a timetable that's determined by the Constitution. Now, if we look at the executive elections, here's where we see a huge difference. The British Prime Minister is elected by the House of Commons. And basically, the British Prime Minister is the leader of the majority party. So, basically what will happen, Commons gets elected, they elect the Prime Minister. Now, in some cases where there is no majority, then parties have to get together, and I'll talk about that. In the United States, the election for the president is separate from the election for Congress. Now, it can happen at the same time. Every representative runs every 2 years, the president runs every 4 years. So when the president's running, basically the president is running with all at the same time as all of the members of the House and a third of the senators. And this is every 4 years. Now, here's the interesting difference between the two systems in terms of how efficient they are. In the British system, the real problem then is, what do you do when nobody has a majority in Parliament? Because there has to be a majority vote to elect a Prime Minister, and basically what has to happen is a coalition government. This is where two or more parties get together so that they have a majority of Parliament, and they make compromises. One party might get one cabinet ministry, another party might get another, and they try to hold the coalition together. Now, the British system is actually a fairly stable two-party system, so you don't see a lot of coalition governments. But when you look at other systems, and I'm thinking Italy off the top of my head, there are so many parties, and it's very difficult for a government to hold itself together because it can't get a majority. But in the British system, that doesn't happen a lot, although it has historically happened where two or more parties have had to get together and form a coalition government. In the United States, there are a number of ways to have gridlock. First of all, just the fact that legislation has to pass two houses makes it more difficult to pass legislation than the British, where you just have to pass through Commons. But the other thing we have is a lot of times we'll have a divided Congress, where one party controls one house of Congress, another party controls another house of Congress. And so for the basically 3rd through 6 years of Obama's presidency, the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, the Democrats controlled the Senate, and so you had a divided Congress. It made it very difficult for bills to get through Congress because the two parties would have to compromise. And as we'll see, it's been relatively difficult for parties to compromise in the past few years. During Obama's first 2 years, he had a Congress that was all Democratic, a Democratic Senate, Democratic House of Representatives, and they were able to pass legislation a lot easier. Although, again, there are still institutional conflicts between the presidency and Congress, and the best example of that really is the Carter presidency, where Jimmy Carter was not really adept at working with Congress, and even though Congress was from the same party, he had some difficulty getting bills passed. Another issue, and this occurs at least during the last 2 years of Obama's presidency, is Congress and the president are from different parties, and so Barack Obama is a Democrat. He is the president. Congress, both the House and the Senate, are dominated by the Republican Party. Now, this also makes it difficult because, as we'll see later, the president can veto legislation. So, if the president doesn't like legislation, he can veto it. And President Obama has already told Congress that there are certain types of bills that he's willing to veto. And so this makes it difficult to get legislation through because, again, Congress and the president have to have some kind of agreement as to how they are going to proceed in terms of passing laws. And so you could see that the parliamentary system is dominated by one political party, and the political party that controls the legislature also elects the executive. And so there's a lot less division within government, whereas in the United States, especially because we have checks and balances, separation of powers, it's possible for different branches of government to be controlled by different parties. And so that is the difference between the American electoral system and especially the British parliamentary electoral system.